The Death of the Sky and the Crimson Fog. April 1816. Jedediah Smith, a hard-working farmer in the rugged hills of Vermont, peered through his window and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The world had transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. Usually this was the season of birdsong and the gentle, thawing breath of spring, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The sky was no longer blue. It was choked by a thick, sickly copper-colored fog that bled into a deep, bruised crimson. The sun, once a source of life, appeared as a ghostly, pale white disk, devoid of heat, shimmering weakly behind a veil of dust. It was so dim that Jedediah could stare directly at it without shielding his eyes. Thousands of miles away, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the heart of an island called Sumbawa had been torn out. The previous year, Mount Tambora had erupted in a cataclysmic fury, ejecting millions of tons of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This invisible shroud had now wrapped itself around the throat of the world, choking out the sun. But to the farmers of the young United States, there was no science to explain this. To them, it felt as though the Almighty had withdrawn his blessing from the earth. May arrived, and with it the desperation of New England. As families prepared to plant their corn and potatoes, the weather took a sinister turn. Frost didn't just visit, it invaded. By mid-May, several inches of snow blanketed Vermont and New Hampshire. When the killing frost bit into the tender young sprouts, anxiety etched itself onto the faces of every farmer. They prayed it was a passing whim of nature, but the cruelty was only beginning. June 6th. By the calendar, it was midsummer, yet a ferocious blizzard slammed into Connecticut and Massachusetts. Imagine the sheer terror of a snowstorm in June. Birds froze mid-flight, dropping like heavy stones from the sky. Sheep, shorn for the summer, turned blue and perished in the fields. One witness wrote in his diary, "I have never seen such a sight in all my life. In the heart of summer, we are shivering in bone-chilling cold. Even the roar of the hearth cannot warm our bones." By July, a silent scream echoed across the eastern seaboard. Food prices skyrocketed beyond comprehension. A bushel of oats that once cost 12 cents surged to 92 cents. Bread became a luxury that the common man could no longer afford. Families were driven to the brink, scavenging for wild nettles, bitter weeds, and even roasting raccoons or rats just to survive. In New York City, long lines of the hollow-eyed and hungry snaked through the streets. Churches overflowed with the terrified, many convinced that the book of Revelation was unfolding before their eyes. In the midst of this apocalypse, the American psyche shifted. Thousands of families, like the Smiths, faced a brutal choice: stay and starve or run. Rumors began to drift back from the frontier, whispers that the West, in Ohio or Indiana, had been spared the frost. This sparked a historic exodus. Families packed their meager lives into covered wagons and vanished into the crimson fog, fleeing an invisible enemy, the cold. But the road was a graveyard. As hundreds trudged through mountain passes choked with unseasonal snow, shallow graves began to line the trails. Disease, famine, and hypothermia became their constant shadows. This was the moment the map of America began to rewrite itself. New England's villages grew quiet and hollowed out, while the wild forests of the West felt the first heavy footprints of the desperate. Across the Atlantic, Europe was drowning in the same sorrow. In Ireland, the potato crops rotted in the ground, sparking a precursor to the Great Famine. In Switzerland, the sound of laughter was replaced by a low, persistent wail of hunger. It was under this very sky, dark, oppressive, and melancholy, that a young woman named Mary Shelley sat by the shores of Lake Geneva. Surrounded by the unnatural gloom, she breathed life into a monster named Frankenstein. The darkness of the atmosphere had finally seeped into the human imagination. The year without a summer was more than a seasonal disaster. It was a crucible for the human spirit. When Jedediah Smith finally reached the borders of Ohio, he looked up to find the sky still pale and sickly, but in the eyes of his fellow survivors, there was a new, iron-willed determination to endure. The Procession of Hunger and the Frozen Heart. July 1816. The calendar insisted it was the height of summer, but across the American Northeast, a bone-chilling northern gale screamed through the valleys. In a small, struggling village in New Hampshire, a farmer named James Reed stood in his cornfield, clutching the small, trembling hand of his 7-year-old daughter. The scene before them was heart-wrenching. Under the weight of a sudden, overnight frost, the vibrant green stalks had turned a sickly black and shriveled. James reached down and touched a young sprout. It didn't bend, it snapped like a shard of ice. That evening, James opened his tattered diary and wrote by candlelight. July 4th, Independence Day, but there is no celebration today. Instead, we pray that tomorrow the sun might show its face for just a moment longer. My children's bellies are empty, and the sky is still choked by that cursed reddish smoke. By mid-July, the American food market had collapsed into chaos. The price of flour soared so high that for a common laborer, buying a single loaf of bread became a desperate impossibility. Livestock began to waste away. There was no grass to graze upon, as the once lush pastures were buried under layers of unseasonal ice. Left with no choice, farmers began to slaughter their beloved cattle and sheep simply because they had nothing left to feed them. But even the meat provided no long-term security. The price of salt had skyrocketed, making it nearly impossible to preserve food for the winter ahead. In the cities, the situation turned feral. In the streets of Boston and New York City, processions of the starving became a daily sight. Men in tattered suits scoured alleyways for scraps of rotting food. Riots erupted like wildfire. Hungry mobs, driven by a primal need to survive, began storming the warehouses of wealthy merchants who were accused of hoarding grain. For the first time, Americans truly understood how fragile their modern civilization was and how quickly it could turn to dust when nature turned its back. Ohio fever, a journey into the unknown. When New England offered nothing but a frozen grave, a phenomenon known as Ohio fever took hold. Whispers spread through the frost-bitten crowds that in the West, in Ohio or Kentucky, the ground was still warm and the soil was still fertile. It was a half-truth born of desperation, but like a drowning man clutching at a straw, thousands of families sold their ancestral homes for pennies and turned their wagons westward. James Reed was among them. His wagon was a rickety assembly of wood and iron, holding nothing but a few clothes and a single precious sack of oats. As they traveled, they saw the roads lined with hundreds of others. Some walked on foot until their boots gave out. Others were pulled by emaciated oxen. Every time they passed a stranger, the question was always the same. Is there food ahead? Is there sun? This mass exodus changed the DNA of America forever. People abandoned their old comforts for the terrifying beauty of the wilderness. This was the birth of the legendary pioneer spirit, but it was paid for in blood. Many children, weakened by hunger, succumbed to pneumonia in the freezing nights. Their parents dug small, lonely graves by the roadside and kept moving. They couldn't afford to stop. Behind them was death. Ahead of them was only a sliver of hope. Superstition and the battle for faith. In an era where the light of science had not yet reached the common man, terror was fueled by fire and brimstone. From the pulpits, preachers thundered that the sun had lost its heat because of the sins of the nation. Bizarre superstitions spread like a plague. Some claimed the massive sunspots visible through the hazy sky were actually trapdoors to hell. Groups of people gathered in town squares, weeping and wailing, convinced the world was ending. In Palmyra, New York, a young man watched this spiritual turmoil with keen eyes. His name was Joseph Smith. His family had been wiped out financially by the 3-year streak of crop failures. In this atmosphere of fear and apocalyptic dread, he began to seek a new kind of revelation, eventually leading to the birth of Mormonism. The dark sky of 1816 didn't just freeze the ground, it upended the internal spiritual world of an entire generation. The silent defeat of science. While the masses prayed, the greatest minds of the age were left baffled. In his Virginia estate, Thomas Jefferson sat at his desk, meticulously recording the temperature every day. He noted with growing unease that even in the midday sun, shadows were faint and blurred. He realized something in the atmosphere was refracting the light, but he lacked the technology to see the truth. He had no way of knowing that a volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was the architect of this misery. August arrived. Traditionally the hottest month of the year, August 16, 1816, saw temperatures in Massachusetts plunge below freezing. That morning, people woke up to find their window panes etched with thick frost. The water in the troughs had turned to solid stone. One man wrote in despair, "Has nature forgotten us? Snow in August? Are we entering an eternal night? Children of the dark and the birth of a new world." Late August 1816, a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the world, stretching from the frozen fields of New England to the jagged peaks of the European Alps. The birds had stopped singing. They simply no longer had the strength to fly. The air was a thick shroud of dry, gray fog. This was the ultimate test of human endurance. When the stomach is empty and the sky rains ice instead of fire, the human mind begins to wander into the dark, conjuring strange and terrifying fantasies. That cursed night at Lake Geneva. This chapter of our story takes us to the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. A group of brilliant minds had gathered at Villa Diodati for a summer holiday. The legendary poets Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, along with Shelley's 18-year-old mistress, Mary Shelley. They expected the golden warmth of the Swiss sun. Instead, they were greeted by an endless deluge of rain and a wind that bit through bone. In the June and July of 1816, the sun was a stranger to Switzerland. Outside, the sky was torn apart by relentless thunder and jagged lightning. Trapped indoors and huddled around candlelight, they proposed a contest to pass the time. Who could write the most terrifying ghost story? That suffocating, lightless atmosphere pushed Mary Shelley's imagination into a macabre realm. She envisioned a man who stitched together pieces of the dead to spark a forbidden life. On that rain-lashed night, the world-famous character Frankenstein was born. In that same room, Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, penned The Vampire, which would later serve as the blueprint for Dracula. Had it not been for the hideous summer of 1816, world literature might never have known these immortal monsters. The darkness of nature had successfully bled into the ink of the human soul. Economic collapse, the Panic of 1819. Returning to American soil, the freezing temperatures of August finally began to lift in early September, but the damage was irreversible. The granaries were empty. The farmers who had fled to Ohio or Kentucky found that the promised land was struggling too. While there was less ice, severe droughts and dust storms had choked the remaining crops. The American economy was almost entirely agrarian. Without a harvest, farmers had no way to repay bank loans. This triggered the first great financial crisis in United States history, the Panic of 1819. Families lost their land, and unemployment soared. Yet from this misery, Americans learned a vital lesson. They could no longer rely on a single crop system. The crisis forced the nation towards crop diversification and underscored the absolute necessity of interstate commerce. A spark of innovation. The horseless carriage, you might ask? The disaster of 1816 made the cost of horse feed, oats and hay so astronomical that most ordinary people could no longer afford to keep horses. In Germany, Baron Karl von Drais sought a solution to this transportation crisis. He engineered a wooden machine with 2 wheels, but no engine or horse. It was propelled by the rider's feet. This was the ancestor of the modern bicycle. It is a strange irony of history. The Indonesian volcano did not just bring famine, it indirectly revolutionized human mobility. In their desperate search for an alternative to the horse, humans took their first major step towards mechanized transport. The thaw and a new dawn. By the beginning of 1817, the volcanic dust in the atmosphere finally began to settle. The sun slowly regained its ancient warmth. When the first balmy winds of spring arrived, many survivors could hardly believe they were still alive. But that single year of darkness had permanently altered the map of America. The awakening of the West. The thousands who had migrated westward never returned. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois rapidly transformed from wild frontiers into bustling territories. Religious resurgence. The spiritual void left by the end-of-days atmosphere gave birth to a wave of new religious and social reform movements. Infrastructure. The government realized that to prevent future starvation, they needed a way to move food quickly between states. This realization greenlit massive projects like the Erie Canal, forever changing American logistics. 1816 was a nightmare, but it taught Americans how to survive the impossible. The resilience of people like James Reed and Jedediah Smith, who prayed by their hearths through those frozen nights, became the very bedrock upon which modern America was built. The volcano's revenge and an eternal lesson. By the end of 1816, as the bone-chilling cold of the northern hemisphere finally began to thaw, the world's population had no idea they had just survived a global catastrophe. In an era without satellites or the internet, there was only the indomitable human spirit fighting for survival. Meanwhile, the true villain of this disaster, Indonesia's Mount Tambora, sat silent, its path of destruction complete. The cataclysmic roar of Tambora. When Tambora first erupted on April 5, 1815, the sound was heard over 1,600 miles away. People initially mistook it for the roar of naval cannons, but when the final massive eruption occurred on April 10th, the volcano's height plummeted from 4,300 meters to just 2,850 meters. Approximately 140 billion tons of ash and smoke billowed into the stratosphere, wrapping the Earth in a shroud of dust. This ash was so fine that it took years to settle, a scientific reality that humanity wouldn't fully grasp for another century. While American farmers feared they were facing divine wrath, the geographical upheaval on one side of the planet was actually upending lives on the other. America's New Horizon, a lasting transformation. The lessons America learned from the frozen summer of 1816 are woven into the country's DNA to this day. Agricultural revolution. Farmers in New England realized that relying on a single crop was a recipe for disaster. They began diversifying, planting crops that could withstand the cold alongside wheat and corn. This laid the foundation for modern crop rotation in America. The importance of connectivity. During the famine of 1816, the lack of roads and waterways was felt acutely. Food existed in some places, while people starved in others. This crisis spurred the greatest infrastructure development in U.S. history. The construction of the Erie Canal in New York was significantly motivated by the food shortages of 1816. Human psychology. That year instilled a preparedness mindset in Americans. They learned the necessity of saving before a crisis strikes. This disaster birthed the famous American spirit of self-reliance. History's incredible conclusion. Survivors like Jedediah Smith or James Reed passed these stories down to their grandchildren. 1816 became known in folklore as 1800 and froze to death. Standing in the modern era, as we discuss climate change, the year 1816 serves as a massive warning. When nature loses its balance, no man-made borders or politics can restrain it. That single year of frigid weather gave world literature Frankenstein, gave the transportation world the bicycle, and helped shape the current map of the United States. The misty, blood-red sun of 1816 is gone, but the stories of human suffering and eventual triumph remain a staggering chapter in history. It is not merely a story of a cold year. It is the story of humanity's journey from the heart of darkness back into the light. The silent killer and the triumph of science. Even after the overcast year of 1816 passed, terror lingered in the hearts of the people. The winters of 1817 and 1818 remained abnormally long and strange. However, slowly but surely, the skies began to clear. Descriptions of golden sunshine finally began to reappear in the diaries of Americans. Yet a haunting question remained suspended in the pages of history. Why did this happen? The people of that era had no answers. The farmers of 1816 went to their graves never knowing the solution to the mystery. It is only through the advancement of modern science that we stand face to face with the answer today, a truth that is enough to send shivers down your spine. Solving the mystery. Testimony beneath the ice. In the 1960s, scientists began drilling deep into the ancient ice layers of Greenland and Antarctica, ice core sampling. They discovered that the ice layers corresponding to the year 1816 contained massive amounts of sulfur and volcanic ash. This was the smoking gun. The monstrous eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 had been so powerful that its chemical signature was preserved forever in the polar ice. Scientists have calculated that if an eruption like Tambora occurred today, at least 1 billion people worldwide would face immediate famine. Yet in 1816, with limited technology and back-breaking labor, Americans managed to conquer that era of darkness. Waves of social change. The cold of 1816 did not just redraw maps, it altered the very equation of human relations. In the northeastern United States, a period of social unrest emerged. When people are hungry, they rebel, but instead of falling into mindless rioting, Americans chose Reconstruction. It was during this time that the first large savings banks became popular in the United States. People realized that saving surplus grain or money was not a luxury, it was the only way to survive. From the trauma of 1816, a culture of saving for the future took deep root within the American middle class. An unbelievable coincidence. As we conclude this story, one startling fact emerges. In that dark year of 1816, while people in the North were starving, the American South, specifically South Carolina and Georgia, witnessed an unusually high harvest of cotton. The strange weather had killed off the pests that usually ravaged northern crops, and the southern heat remained just tolerable enough for growth. Tragically, the success of this cotton harvest indirectly strengthened the institution of slavery in the South for several more decades. 1816 remains the ultimate example of how strange and interconnected history can be. Final words, our lesson. The year 1816 serves as a reminder that we are not the masters of nature, but rather its guests. Today, as we check the weather in our smartphones in seconds, we must not forget our ancestors who stood in the snow for months on end, without any forecast, praying to the sky for the sun to return. The American pioneer spirit, that iron-willed mentality of overcoming adversity, was forged within the crimson dust and bone-chilling cold of 1816. From those ashes, a new America rose like a phoenix, stronger, more innovative, and more united than ever before. The Soul Beneath the Ash and the Embryo of Modern America. The frozen summer of 1816 was not merely a natural disaster. It was a trial by fire, or rather by ice, for the national character of the young United States. When the sky lost its blue and turned a haunting copper, a new philosophy was born out of the intersection of terror and faith. This chapter takes us to the forgotten people whose names never made it into history books, yet whose struggle built the foundation of the modern world. Daniel Wheeler's Diary and the Battle for Survival. On a small farm in Connecticut lived a young man named Daniel Wheeler. On a freezing July morning, he found himself standing in his barn, a knife in hand, preparing to slaughter his last remaining horse. His 10-year-old son clung to his arm, sobbing. That horse was their last hope for labor, their only pride. But Daniel knew the truth. There wasn't a single handful of oats left in the cellar to feed the animal. The horse's meat would be the only thing keeping his family alive for another 7 days. Daniel wrote in his diary, "Today I did not just kill an animal. I sacrificed my children's future. But if this darkness does not lift, we will all be buried beneath this ice." Daniel's agony was a mirror for every American father at that time. Yet remarkably, this extreme poverty gave birth to a new kind of communal living. Neighbors who had never spoken before began to share a single hearth. The culture of sharing, born from the absolute necessity of survival, strengthened the very concept of the American neighborhood. The literature of darkness and the spiritual revolution. The unsettling atmosphere of 1816 didn't just inspire Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it seeped into America's own folklore. Elders sat by the fire telling tales of a great beast that had swallowed the sun. A sense of the supernatural gripped the public mind. This era coincided with the surge of the Second Great Awakening. When people found no answers in the physical world or the science of the day, they turned to the spiritual. New churches and religious sects began to flourish. They preached a powerful message. If the world were to end today, is your soul prepared? This spiritual movement taught the people patience and resilience, though it also sowed the seeds of deep-seated religious conservatism. New horizons in science, the birth of the weather report. Before 1816, most people believed the weather was simply a whim of God. But after the catastrophe, an educated class of thinkers began to wonder, could these atmospheric changes be predicted? This was the primitive beginning of modern meteorology in America. Figures like Thomas Jefferson began to keep meticulous daily records of wind speed and temperature. They realized that if such a disaster were to strike again, humanity could not afford to be unprepared. The transformation of Ohio, from wilderness to heartland. Meanwhile, life for those who had fled to Ohio was a different kind of hell. Though the weather was slightly more tolerable, they faced dense, unexplored forests and the constant threat of wild animals. But the cold of 1816 had taught them how to build shelters rapidly and survive on wild berries and roots. The lush, golden wheat fields we see today in Ohio or Illinois were built on the sweat and blood of those hungry 1816 pioneers. They didn't clear the forests for profit. They did it for the right to live another day. Not an end, but a new beginning. By 1818, as life finally began to return to normal, people looked back in a state of shock. The crimson fog was gone, but a deep scar remained in the collective memory. They had learned that nature could take away in an instant what it gave in a season. The American pioneer spirit was not a journey of joy, it was a desperate life-or-death struggle. The America that rose from the ashes of the dark summer was more cautious, more strategic, and more self-assured. It was an America that knew how to survive the dark because it had already seen the end of the world. The scales of justice and the hearth's flame. Late 1816, as grain grew scarcer, theft became a desperate act of survival. In a small town in Massachusetts, a young man named John White was caught stealing a single sack of corn from a private warehouse. His crime was clear, but his motivation was heart-wrenching. His elderly mother and young sister had not eaten in 3 days. In those days, the penalty for theft was brutal, flogging or long imprisonment. However, when John White stood before the judge, something extraordinary happened. The judge, whose own family was surviving on rations, looked at the gaunt, trembling boy. John spoke only a few words. "I could not watch my mother die. I am willing to work, but there is no work and there is no grain." Instead of passing a sentence, the judge ordered his own personal stores to be shared with John's family. This act became a legendary example of humanitarian justice during the crisis. Americans began to realize that in times of catastrophe, the survival of the community was higher than the letter of the law. The shift in politics. President James Madison was facing a nation in turmoil. Still recovering from the wounds of the War of 1812, the young government was now hit by this unexplainable famine. The federal government was weak at the time, but the crisis of 1816 forced a change. It became clear that without a unified federal response, individual states would crumble under the weight of such disasters. This realization laid the groundwork for a stronger, more centralized American government. Entertainment in the dark, storytelling by the fire. With no modern distractions, families huddled around the only source of warmth, the fireplace. In the freezing nights of 1816, American folklore was truly born. Grandparents spun tales of a snow giant who could freeze entire villages with a breath. These weren't just ghost stories, they were cautionary tales designed to teach children the discipline required to survive a brutal winter. From these seeds, early versions of legendary characters like Paul Bunyan emerged, heroes with superhuman strength who could tame a wild and indifferent nature. The awakening of science, decoding the fog. The mysterious dry fog of 1816 had finally caught the attention of the scientific world. In Europe and America, astronomers began collecting dust samples from the air. Though they didn't yet know of Mount Tambora, they confirmed that the atmosphere was clogged with particles absorbing the sun's heat. This marked the very beginning of serious research into atmospheric pollution and its direct impact on global climate. The Thaw and a Strange Spring. In February 1917, just when hope seemed lost, the world began to change. One morning, the ice began to weep, and the bone-chilling bite of the wind faded. For the first time in over a year, birdsong returned to the Mallees. People fell to their knees in the melting slush, thanking God as the first blades of grass pierced through the frozen earth. But it was a hollow victory. The fields were empty because most farmers had been forced to eat their seed corn just to stay alive. This crisis forced the government to step in and facilitate seed imports, giving birth to the first concept of agricultural grants in American history.